All right, are we ready to mock people? There was a comma. Are we ready to mock people? No. Yeah. All right. So just to have you exercise a bit, how many of you know what is a mock server or are familiar with the concept of a mock server? Can we have those people stand up, please? Yeah. Yeah, just to get some action. Thank you. I love how you all listen to me. Yes, quite a lot. Now, can we have you sit down? Yeah. We had someone stretching at the back. Wow. So I'll just make sure that, again, we are on the same page. So mock servers are, they can get very funny, very insulting, very quick, unless you make sure that you are mocking properly, but no. So mock servers are where you have a dummy variant of an API, and Postman mock servers are hosted remotely in the services that Postman offers. Now, you do have alternates like Pact, where Pact.io. Pact's mock servers run locally, and Postman's mock servers run in the Postman cloud. So what Postman gives you is a URL where you can make your calls and get the response back. The interesting thing is, though, you can create mock servers from a collection, and the examples that we saved, those examples are what the mock server would use to match the response to send you. So if you remember what we did, just to kind of go back, in the get all cats, we added two examples, right? We added a success use case and we added a failure use case. And the success use case is I'm telling Postman that my example says that for get URL /cats, for /cats, get /cats, if the response is for 200 response, my response would look like this. So I've already documented this, right? Now, what do I need to create a mock server from this? Trust me, it's really simple. All I have to do is click, and let's give my mock server this particular environment. All right, so I'm going to click this. I can go to mocks. And in the popover, I can create a mock server from here. So mocks are tied to collections currently in Postman. What this means is your collection is, again, going to be the underlying data type or the data from which the mocks are generated. So you are telling Postman that take my collection, take the examples that are part of my request, and send me those as response. Because I have already told Postman, told my collection what my example, what my collection my requests body, no, responses body looks like. There are so many terms I get confused, yeah. All right, the other way that you can do is you can again go to the new button on top, and you can click that you want to create a mock server. You can create a new API, or you can use a collection from this workspace. And this is the same view that you would come to through either flow. So what I want to do is create a cat management blueprint mock, and I'm just going to call it v0.1 because currently I'm just following that spec. I don't have a version tag. More about version tags in a while. Let me just attach my, maybe the staging thing that I had created, and I'm going to hit create. Now, when I hit create here, what happened was Postman gave me this particular URL, followed by, it says that send a request to this mock URL, followed by the request path. And there was a question sometime back that what endpoint I'm hitting. Am I hitting a mock server? So it was essentially for this. So let's say I have this here, and I hit /cats. I'm doing get /cats. This is not a saved request. And look at what I got back. I got the 200 OK status, and I got the exact same thing that I had saved in my example response. And this was being served from the mock itself. So what Postman has done is started a server for you based on the collection, and it's tied to the collection. So let's do one interesting thing. I will go back to my example success example. And I'm going to say that, okay, Lucy is actually 3 years old in my example. And I have saved it, so I'm back to my tab where I had sent the request. And let's change that. And you see that the mock actually got updated the moment I updated and saved my collection. So the mock is essentially serving whatever is in the example response of the request that I'm hitting. Now, mocks have a request matching algorithm in Postman. This is also documented in our documentation portal. So we have multiple algorithms where it tries to match by the path, it matches by the HTTP request method. It can also match by the exact response status that you asked for. So let's say one of the things that we had created were a failure scenario as well, right? We had a, what was the failure scenario for this? 403, yeah. So I had a scenario for 403. So what I can do is I can pass this specific, was this response code? Yep. So an interesting thing happened there. This is a Postman mock specific header that you can pass to mock servers in Postman. And using this, you can test as part of your workflow that what would my API respond if if it was responding with something wrong. So you can write your test cases around this while you are testing, and you can also test for failure scenarios. Question is it only based on the status? So you can have like you can build more complex examples with parameters. You can have more. We have introduced something called wildcard matching, which just released yesterday, I think. So I'm not going to show it because it's slightly more complex, but essentially we have a wildcard matching, we have a path-based matching, then we have a request response code-based matching, you have a response header-based matching, response header, right? Huh? Request header, sorry. Request header-based matching. So the request header-based matching is useful if, let's say, your API responds with multiple data formats. It might be responding with a JSON or CSV of the same data. You can emulate that with Postman as well in the mock servers.
There are multiple examples for the same request. Does it randomize the responses? Or
yeah, so question is if there are multiple responses for the same request, does it randomize? So I showed you one example where my examples were one for a 200 status code, one for a 403 status code. So when I put this xmock response code, that is when I'm telling mock that I want get/cats, but for the 403 status code. So it will match that. If there are multiple 200 status code, then it's going to match based on the order or the name. Did you know? Order, right? Yeah. So there is this long list of matching algorithms. I would love to go into details, but we are slightly short on time, so I don't want to go into that. But there is a page on learning.getpostman.com, which is the docs /docs. There is a page on matching algorithms for mocks, and that is where these exact ones are documented. But in real life use cases, the things that come most commonly in use are the response codes, because most APIs have one success scenarios and multiple failure scenarios. And those failure scenarios, as in most endpoints, and those failure scenarios for a RESTful API usually would have multiple status codes. But things get complicated when you have a GraphQL mock or you have maybe a XML-based mock returning different status. So again, you can match based on headers, based on query parameters, based on the path, based on request methods, and use all of this combination to come up with your own suite. And all you need to do to manage that is just create different examples of all the types. Now, So I have created a example, I have created a mock here. So what I can do, however, is let me take this mock URL endpoint and I'm going to go to my develop and I'll change the URL to this mock URL, whatever was the base URL of the mock. So what I want is, now if I am looking at add a cat, now if I send this, I forgot to set connection headers there. All right, let's see. Set application JSON. Let's edit the example. Headers, application JSON, headers. So I'm just editing the response headers for the example for the post add a cat. And save it. Go back and send it. There you go. So what Postman does is also infers the response. So the response view that you see when you send a request in Postman is inferred from the headers as well, from the response headers. So I had forgotten to add that response header in the example. So now that I have added it, it's in there. Do you have a question somewhere?
No, we have a seat open.
Sorry?
We're good.
Oh, cool. Okay, so what you see happening is kind of like using the blueprint collection from a consumer's perspective as well. So let's say, now let's take a step back. We have the blueprint collection. We have created a mock out of it, which is serving requests based on the examples that were created in that blueprint collections requests. Now, you as the producer, what you would share with your consumers, especially if this is an internal API that you are building, would be the blueprint collection, the environment template, and the mock. And what you can do is either give them the mock URL, or you can put that in the environment itself and share it. So as you change something, as you like update your blueprint collection, the mock would also keep on updating. But since we used a base URL variable here, when you send the blueprint collection to someone and you give them the mock ID, they don't necessarily have to look at the examples, but they can directly send a request and look at what the response would be like, just like how an actual collection would be. And then what you would do as you start developing, let's say you are the team which is building a service which consumes this particular API. As you are developing, once you have reached a certain stage when that service is hosted on a staging environment, you can just switch the variable URL and have it point to a whole different server. So these are some of the things where you build it from day one to retain the flexibility that I mentioned, that you also need to make sure that your design has the flexibility to change or adapt to changes as it grows. So just one of the small things which make your life better. Now, I won't go too much in depth into tests, but what you can also do is have tests in your blueprint collection itself, because let's say it's one thing to look at the response and see what it looks like, but what if I also want to make sure that when I am sending a request, I am getting it within a certain time frame, or the response object behaves in a certain way. So for that, you can write your tests here, and in that case, the tests will get executed every time the request is sent. So not going too much into the tests right now, but let's say, so what we have done is created mock server from blueprint and executed mock against the blueprint. So before I go to the next section, any question around mocks apart from what I've already asked? Yes. So just one thing, mocks can be a reasonably elusive concept, so feel free to ask me even basic questions.
Is there a limited amount of time that that mock exists? So, like, if I open my collection in a year from now and run that mocked request, does it always is it going to be there?
Very interesting question. It stays there as long as your account is there with Postman. And so if you delete the collection on which the mock is based, that will also remove the mock because currently the mocks are based on collections. And even if you, so if you noticed when I was creating the mock from the new thing, it gave me an option to just start with the paths. So even if I do it there, it would generate a new collection in the workspace and use that collection to create the mock. So if your collection gets deleted or if your account, if you delete your team account, then those would go away, or if you delete the mock. Otherwise, mocks stay there running whenever you need them. Yeah.
On the mock, does it look at the authentication headers, like the bearer token? Does does the matching algorithm include that as one of the criteria?
So we, at this point, it does not take a very strong decision based on the authentication mechanism that you do. So mocking of the authorization schemes is something that you can emulate using other means, but directly using mock servers, we don't have it right now. But I know that it's something that is in the works, like the ability to also emulate authentication mechanisms. The only place where you can have an overlap is if you have a private mock server. So by default, by the way, any mock servers that you create, if you have not checked the make this mock server private option, or you haven't edited and made it private, that URL is a public URL, even though it's a reasonably complicated URL. So anyone, anywhere can use it. When you make a mock server private, you need to use a Postman API key to make the request. So if you are, let's say, working within your team and you're dealing with sensitive data, you don't want that to be a public one. So what would happen, let's actually create a mock server which is private. So I have this one which I created. And let me actually go ahead and delete that. And mocks are lightweight that way. If you are OK with the URLs changing, you can delete and recreate. But typically, we keep one mock server running so that since we have already shared that URL with our team, right? Okay, let's create. I'm going to give it the same one. And you see this option here, make this mock server private. So when we create this, it says that, okay, you need to get an API key here. Right. So this is part of the dashboard. What I would do I have API keys now? I'm going to create an API key. I'm going to call it postcon demo. And I have a Postman API key. Now using this API key, I can make requests, I can make requests against this mock server. So let's look at this first one. Since I did not add any authorization information, when I try it, it says that, okay, mock not found. And this is just us being very clever and not telling you if it actually exists or not, or if it is private. So what we can do is add a API key authorization, which I would say the key is X API key, and the value I'm just hard coding. You should not hard code, and I'm adding it. So the moment I added my API key, I start getting my response. So let's do something funny. If you remember, I had, not in this, sorry. So this is my mock, And this is my mark. Okay. So what I'm going to do is go to my develop. I'm going to put my API key, and I'm going to update the new mocks URL, which I can get from here. I'm going to give it the new mock URL. So I'm going to edit, paste the new URL. Okay, and let's just have some interesting fun here. I'm going to change this to have, let's say we decided that our API also uses X API key authentication, so that I can use both. Right. All right. So I did a few things pretty quick, but let me run you through what I just did. I created a new mock server, which I made into a private mock. Then I went to the dashboard, and I created an API key for the Postman API that I can use to call my private methods of the Postman API, including private mocks that I have created. And those API keys are at a workspace level, so other team members can also reuse the same API keys, or they can create their own. And since now I have to also use the API key as part of my response, I just did a interesting change in the example that we have been following, as in the use case. So let's say our hypothetical API also is a protected API, and it takes an API key as an authentication. And just to make sure that it has the same name, let's call it X-API-key. So in real life, when someone is building, when a consumer is calling your API, they would pass the X API key with the API key that you give them at that point. But since we're using the same name, we can piggyback on the mock server infrastructure that Postman provides to also run our systems. So what I did then is I went and edited the collection, went to the authorization, and changed the authorization type to API key, and named it X API key, which is the same as the Postman API asks for. Gave it a value where the value is the API key variable. And I had added my API key in the Postman, in the environment here. So now if I still send it, I got this. Because in the authorization here, I had inherit auth from parent. So let's see what happens if I change this to no auth. That is, I'm saying that this request does not need an authorization. Okay, it goes and hits and says that mock not found error, because I'm dealing with a private mock.
It seems like a limitation of this is that you wanted to build your test cases with a mock server, a private mock server.
No, that's just me using it for our example.
Right, but then you want to take that same test case and you want to run it against an implementation, a real implementation. You have to go in and change the authorization.
Yes.
In the collection.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's true. That is also something that you would typically put in a blueprint collection. And the way the Postman API, so I'll just iterate the question, is that what I just did looks like a limitation of the mock API, because if I'm also using the same, if I am not using the same mechanism as the Postman API uses, then my blueprint collection will have some other reference of authorization, whereas my mocks would need a different authorization scheme in the private thing. So you can also pass the API key as a parameter in here. And one of the things that we often do is either inject this parameter programmatically as part of the collection, and just include an API key equals the Postman parameter value if the API key is present. So you can do a lot of workflows around that. Yeah.
So can we write any scripts on the mock server so that when a request comes, it runs that script and then responds?
The question is, can we run some scripts on the mock server level so that when a request comes, we have some programmatic things happening? So short answer, no. Compromise, possible. We have a bunch of dynamic variables that Postman provides. So there is a huge list. Previously, it was just GUID, timestamp, and these are the kind of dynamic variables that you could create. So we have some variables which, let's just say, in this case, and so if you start a new variable anywhere in the editor, in the data editor, and you start with $, we have a bunch of random variables or dynamically generated variables that Postman generates at runtime that start with $. So if you start $, you will see it autocomplete. Now, if you have something like this in your example, this would get resolved every time, and this internally is using the Faker library. So if any of you in testing, you would know that there is this thing called Faker. So Postman also integrates Faker, so you can do that, which is kind of a mid-level compromise because mocks do not really let you programmatically control execution or the response. We hope to get there one day because that is one of the most commonly asked features. Yeah, so very sophisticated mocking is something that the whole API industry is trying to get towards. And this is something that is coming up as an industry trend, I would say, where as people realize the power of mock APIs, you realize that, okay, I can do a lot more if I could just programmatically create a few things at the mock stage. So we're getting there. I don't know when, but soon.
So these are the variables that you showed on the request level. So while creating the mock servers, can these variables be used?
Yes.
The timestamp back or
Yes, you can. You can. So let's actually do that. The question is, can I actually use those variables when I am returning a response? Now, you can use them in examples as well. So let's say I want this to be random int. Was that it? So success, get all cats. Yep. So I added, what I did was I edited the body and added this random variable called random int, which generates a random integer number. So now I have a beautiful age for my cat. It's 372. Yeah.
When I have multiple examples within my request, which one the mock gonna take? How do I tell them to take a particular example?
Yeah, so this is the same question that we were discussing some time back, that how does mock decide which exact example it picks? So if you have multiple examples and they are all of the same status code and the same same name, it's going to choose the order in which you have created them or the order in which they are ordered. Everything is there. Apart from that, if you have multiple response code based examples, like one for, let's say, 200, one for 403, 500, 404, and all, you can specify the xmock response code header. So that would be part of the request that you are sending to the mocks. And
you can also use mock response name. So you can just
Yeah.
get the response with the response name as well.
Yeah, so the same order that I was talking of is when the names are also same. I mean, you should ideally not do that. But in case you have, so you can use the mock response name, and that is also why we use a lot of the things that you see me doing are more patterns or ways of using Postman and not really the feature that Postman provides. So the success, the naming convention of the examples, the naming convention of the examples here are also interesting. So if you have multiple success responses, for example, for the get all cats, I can create an example showing that what does it look like when there are no entries. I may just want to return an empty array. So I can create a new success example and just say that when there are no cats available, just return an empty array. And then when I'm calling the mock server, I can specify that in my header, saying that X mock response name, and tell it that this is the response name I want you to match. So in short, you can think of mocks as like a tabular or a two-dimensional data where you can tell the mock server that give me the response of this particular request, which has this status code, and it will give you that one back. So programmatically, not possible yet, but you can create multiple permutation combinations. And the good thing is, since these are examples that you're creating, all the different examples that you add end up enriching the documentation generated from your collection, because you then start getting these multiple options for each of these. Yeah, you start getting all these multiple options. So anyone who's viewing your docs then would be able to see it. Now, at this point, it doesn't feel like a lot, but imagine if you publish this documentation publicly. So you might have a partner API. We have this thing called API network in Postman where you can publish a collection, and that gets listed publicly. Or you can use a run in Postman button and export, as in share that collection to someone else. So in those cases, when someone looks at a generated documentation, the examples end up populating that, and they can then create their own mock servers, something that is hosted under their account from the collection that you share, which technically means that you don't necessarily have to share a mock server with everyone. All you need to share with people is the collection. So comes back to what I said at the very beginning, that everything starts with a good collection. If your collection is ordered properly, you create a mock server from it, a monitor from it, you write your test suites around it, it's just going to fall in place one after the other. So these small changes make things way better. Yes, sir.
I mean, API rate limits on this, on the free tier and above.
Getpostman.com/pricing is where you can look at the tier limits on the free ones. They are reasonably lenient, I would like to believe. All right, any more questions there? Yeah.
Yeah, you said that I can specify which example my mock server would pick up. How do I do that?
Which example you want to serve? Yes, you can specify.
Yeah, how?
Sorry, I had only showed the response code. So let's just create a new request, which I will not save into this collection, but I will just use the same one. So those are done using specific headers, request headers. Now, when I, let's say, get this, and I'm still using the develop environment, which is my latest created mock, I get this mock not found error because I have not added added the API key. All right. All right. So I got the success use case by default. So the default one it picks if it matches the path is the 200 response that you've created. Now, if I want it to send me some other request, I can give it X mock response code. And I say that give me something that matches the, if there is an example that matches 403, give me that. And this is the one that I had created for 403. Now let's say I want something for 404. I send it and mock says that we could not find it because you actually don't have an example for 404. But if I want it to give me the failure scenario without me telling what the exact value is, I can tell it failure, what was? Failure, invalid credentials. Yeah. So what I did this time was I did not tell it the exact status code to give me, match by the status code, but I asked it to match by the example name. So the response name here maps to the name that I have given to the example response. So I can create multiple such responses, and I can request any specific one. So these are all the different matching algorithms that mock lets you use. And then you can also have, like, it depends on how you structure, essentially. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Question about the examples. Is there a way to copy, duplicate, or bulk manage examples?
Bulk manage examples. Interesting. I don't think we have like a bulk managing thing of examples, but what you can do, the copy, can we copy? Sorry. We can't copy examples, can we? Yeah. We can't copy at this point, but good. I'm going to note that down as a feature request.
Okay.
But what you can do, however, for creating an example, like I had mentioned it earlier, if you are working with an existing API endpoint, you can save the response as an example. So if, let's say, you have got something back, and the save response has a save as example option. So you can use that if you're mocking an existing endpoint. Yeah.
You showed that there is possibility to enter this headers key, like xmock, but there is no autocomplete on those, where one can find the list of possible values for the keys. And the variables like random int that you used.
Those are all part of our documentation on learning.getpostman.com. So you can look for dynamic variables in Postman, and there is a long list of the variables. Mock has a documentation on matching algorithm and the different status codes. But the status code that you specify in the example is what you would want to use. Postman just auto-completes it for you. All right. Any more questions that we have? Are we good?
Let's keep going.
Yep. Thank you. So I'm just going to quickly show this part because I don't want to spend a lot of time on the exact OpenAPI schema, but I just wanted to show you that the question that came up here, that why doesn't Postman export to OpenAPI? Because, well, we can work with OpenAPI. So if you look at the APIs tab here, this is still in beta, so whatever I show you here, take it with a pinch of salt because it's growing as we talk, it's evolving. What you can do now with Postman is create an entity that connects all your collections together with a schema. And remember the single source of truth that I mentioned? So you can use this as a single source of truth in your organization for the API design and management layer. Now, just so you know, when we say create an API from Postman's perspective, we are talking of the interface, not the implementation. So we are talking of the schema of the API. We are not talking of actually of generating the code or hosting the API. Like maybe we'll get there someday, but not today. What we can do, however, is we let's say have an API entity where I can call it cat management API. So I just created a new API under there. And what an API does in Postman, and I know there are terminology overlaps here. So when I say the API entity, I mean this thing in Postman. And if you create it and you look at the define tab there, we have a schema portion, if anyone's following along. Otherwise, I'll just show it here. So you can either create a new one or you can import a file. Now, the curious thing, when you import a file here, it's not generating a collection for you. It actually lets you work with the OpenAPI schema here. So I have something that I created for myself here. So if you want to follow this URL, I have just a simple schema for this cat management API thing. This is bit.ly/postman-api-yaml. So this will take you to a GitHub gist. I'll just repeat that, bit.ly/postman-api-yaml. So if you go there, the API v0.1 is what we are building. So what you can do is just copy over. This is a valid OpenAPI 3.0 spec in YAML format. And sorry, I can move and copy it here, change this to YAML. So now I can actually author and edit my specs here. So I had previously created the whole thing. Now, if you are going API first, you might want to start at the schema layer. Depends on how you work. So once again, when I say these things, take them with a grain of salt because these are like TDD or BDD. These are just different ways of working. What works best for you would be how exactly your workflow is like. I'm just telling you different combinations possible. So if you want to start with a schema as part of your API design, this is where you would start. You would write the schema here. You would be able to, we are coming up with better validations, annotations around schemas, the ability to assert on a schema structure, going ahead, generating mocks directly from schemas. So we are going to get better integration with all of these schema formats. And currently, we have support for all of these formats in OpenAPI, but you can also have your specs in OS 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, RAML, and GraphQL. So the GraphQL schema, if you are using GraphQL, would be the actual schema of the GraphQL server, which if you have the GraphQL schema here, Postman can also autocomplete the GraphQL thing, but I don't want to get into GraphQL because another big discussion. Happy to talk about it for the whole day after the workshop. Because I don't know how many of you know, but we do have a nice thing after the workshops. Okay, so not going in details of the OpenAPI specification here. This is essentially the exact thing that we built in the collection. What you can do, once you have it here, if you want to have a quick start, you can click the generate collection, which is going to generate a collection based on this OpenAPI spec, which is actually the same as clicking the import here and importing the OpenAPI schema, except in this case, what's going to happen is your OpenAPI schema is going to live within Postman, and you can author it from there. But here's the interesting part. I have got this version available now. I can add a description for this API. And since we are designing the interface here, we can also design it for specific versions. By default, it creates a draft version. Let's say my first version is going to be called v0.1. And I'm going to say that I am currently designing the API for, or this is the interface for v0.1 of the cat management API. And since I have already created a blueprint, a collection which documents all of these, I can add that collection. I can switch to the develop tab. So I'm still within that API. I can switch to the develop tab, say add documentation. I only have one collection in this workspace. So this is going to select different collections. And I can add that in here. So now when someone looks at this API, so I can tell them that, you know what, this is my spec for the API. This is my OpenAPI spec. I have got these collections which I use for documentation. I have also created a mock server. I can create a new one or add an existing one. And I probably should rename that mock server. So I have my mock server added here. I want to say that, okay, I have got a production environment for you. I also have a staging environment for you. And I have a develop environment for you. So now I'm getting into a view. If you can see, what I'm doing is creating that single source of truth where if someone wants to know that what are my collections that I can use as the blueprint for this API, or what are the collections that I can use as a test suite for this API, I can add them here. I do have a collection that I had in another team, which let me open it up. And I can just import that and then show you how that works, because that's got a bit of test around it. So the initial thing that I had shown you, so let me export it here because I'm exporting it across teams. I've got it, check-in management. And I come here, import files. So the only reason I'm having to export it is because I'm moving it across teams. I'm working in, I've got 2 instances of Postman open, and they are both looking different. So yeah, I'll just run you through this collection for a while, but let's say what I have here is a contract test collection. So I'm going to add that collection as a contract test. Now, the key thing is when we say contract tests, integration tests, or test suites, or documentation, they are all collections. These are just collections that I'm using in different ways. A collection where I have documented everything, or a collection that is meant to be run and as in meant to be executed, and it has got tests which would validate all the results. So I can then have this full visibility into what are the test suites and everything that I have for a specific version of an API. And I can also, currently we don't, in the beta of API, we don't have that strong a linking with the schema and the collection. So going ahead, we would have a kind of constantly updated schema, because one of the things that we are trying to get to is have the reference blueprint collection generated from this schema that you write here. So currently, if you click the generate collection, let's say cat management, generated collection, and it says add this collection to your API as documentation. So this generated the way the OpenAPI importer would work. So internally, it's just calling the OpenAPI importer and generating the collection. Now, going ahead, what we would have probably is a way that when you update the schema here, it also updates the connected collection. Yeah, that doesn't happen today, but so this is still why there is the beta label on that, because we are trying to validate the hypothesis that a single source of truth is useful, and that the future for Postman is not just as a collection, or not just importing from multiple different formats or exporting to them, but actually working with them, understanding the real world use case where I might like GraphQL, you might like OpenAPI 2.0, but someone else is using 3.0. It's just better to play together than to, give and take from each other. So that's the API thing in a nutshell. There are versioning, more versioning things that you can do, like create a new version. But one curious thing that, apart from the versioning that I've already shown you, the forking and merging, what you can do is you can create version tags. If you are used to Git, this is similar to a tag in Git, which is just a reference that points to a specific commit. So you can scroll down the change log of a collection, and you can choose any changelog item and say add a version tag, where if it is part of an existing API, if there is an existing API in that workspace, it will tell you that. It will tell you where do you want to add it. So since this is my blueprint, I'm just going to add the version tag 0.1, which is the same version that I created here. Now when I see here, I have a collection with the version 0.1 tagged to that changelog. I'll show you how this is useful. Let's delete the generated collection, because we have already generated better ones. So if you think about it, if we were having this workshop 1 year in the future, this workshop would have been shorted by 30 minutes at least, because the blueprint collection would have been generated from the specs that all we created manually. All right, I'm going to delete this. Right, so I have tagged my collection as v0.1. Now, let's say what happens if I go to the blueprint collection. This is also answered in answer to that question that what if somebody accidentally edits something. Let's say I've made this one change, which is I removed the description. I have my header. I have authorization set. All right. Okay. So now when I look at the documentation for this, I can actually access my docs by version. So this would be the version tags that I have created for that collection. Now, if I look at the v0.1, I had tagged an earlier changelog, and then I made some more edits. So for Postman, there are the collection has gone ahead, but I have tagged v0.1 to be a particular changelog. So when I go to v0.1, I still see my exact data that I had at that point. But if I want to see what's the current version of the collection, I can go in there and see that, okay, I've removed this description, and I've removed the picture there. So you can also share a specific version path. And in future, we would also have better linkability between the API collection. So currently, it just tells you that it's version tagged at a certain level. So what you can do now, let's take a step back. You are the producer, and you have created v0.1. You have designed everything. Your team has started working on it. You have created a mock server, which you have given to your consumer team, and they are working on the APIs on their own. So one of the things that they might do is create a contract collection or create any form of test suite on their end to actually validate that the API works properly or not. So what I have here in this collection, actually before that, let me take a step back. So I showed this versioning. I'm going to skip the questions. And this is where I am right now. So yeah. So as part of the mocks that the consumer is receiving from the publisher or the producer here, they can use that to create their own changes to work with the responses and switching base URL. That is, they can even test against different versions of the mocks, because you can tag mocks as versions as well, or you can create a new mock for a different version of the collection, and you can keep on testing those. So the contract collection that I have, it's also got 2 endpoints currently. So let's focus on this particular one, the add a new cat. So this is from a consumer's perspective, where I want to ensure that when I send the request for add a new cat, I know that let's say hard coding something here, but I know that I'm supposed to get an ID in return if it is successful. So I write these tests here. So these are the tests that are written in JavaScript, and these are syntax based on the Chai JS assertion library, which is what Postman uses internally. But what I'm doing here is I've got multiple tests. One checks for a status code, one checks for the data structure, says that I should get a JSON data, which is an object. It should have a property called ID, which should be a number, and the ID should be above 0. Just putting some sanity checks in there. And then there is some things happening here, which is essentially just taking the variable and setting it, as in taking the value, setting it in a variable so that the next request can use it. That's part of collection runs, something that the next workshop is going to talk about. But if I send this request, I see that I have test results where I got 401, which is because my authorization. Yes, my mocks authorization failed. Yeah. Yep. So From a consumer's perspective, you would, let's say, write these tests and assert on them. So the blueprint, the one that you create as a reference collection as a producer, might not be ideally made to be dealing with a mock server, but this other collection which checks for the actual response, asserts on the response structure, code, and just make sure that everything is in the right place is something that the consumer will be able to create from this. So with that, I have already shown you. I'm going to skip this versioning, the v0.2. What you can do is actually, sorry, let's go back. Try doing this by yourself and see how you feel about it. So you can create a new version in the API. You can use the second file that's in that URL, and you can work with that, and you can create tags for new collections, look at how the documentation looks like when you have got multiple collections. And that's it. So finally, any questions around this whole thing?